seems that we are live. Just waiting. So we are live now. So hello everyone and everybody. I'm delighted to welcome today here with us Neal Ford and Mark Richards, two greatest experts in software architecture and obviously best practices. Neal is a director and software architect at ThoughtWorks, and Mark is an independent hands-on software architect. And he just posted that he's a founder of developer2architect.com. So please follow him on that. Mark and Neal are both hands-on practitioners who have taught software architecture classes professionally for years and focus on architecture principles that apply across all technology stacks. In this session, Neal and Mark will share insights from their published book, Head First, Software Architecture. In this book club, we'll talk about how and why the book was created, some of the topics within the book, and how this book differs from the previously published fundamentals of software architecture. And just before we start, a quick reminder to our viewers, in this session, we appreciate the questions. So please leave your questions in the YouTube chat so Neal and Mark can address them later or during the presentation. So guys, thank you for coming to our book club. It's all yours. Mark, Neal.
All right. Thank you so much, Evgeny. And hello and welcome to this book club podcast. Specifically, as Evgeny said, we're going to be talking about our latest book that both Neal and I wrote with Raju Gandhi, and that is the Head First Software Architecture book from O'Reilly. You'll recognize my voice as Mark Richards, and I'm going to turn it over to Neal to have him introduce himself.
Hello, everyone. Good morning for me, but good afternoon for many of you. And whenever you're listening to this podcast, it may be the middle of the night. So greetings for whatever time zone it's in. As you can see from the label here right under me, my name is Neal Ford. And we're here today to talk about Head First Software Architecture. So the first question Evgeny asked is probably the first question our audience would have was, why did we write another book about software architecture? We wrote the book Fundamentals of Software Architecture, and then we turned around and a few years later wrote Head First Software Architecture. So why in the world would we do that? Well, Mark and I for a long time have realized that different people like to learn in different ways. In fact, the other thing that Mark and I have done a lot of is create streaming videos for the O'Reilly publisher, who also publishes our books. We have hours and hours of streaming video on software architecture. We also do live hosted classes online. And Head First is a unique proposition from an educational standpoint because it is very specifically designed to cater to individuals who like to learn in this super highly interactive, I sort of jokingly call it the ADD guide to software architecture because there's constant little call outs and little distractions and exercises, but a lot of people really like learning in that style. And Mark and I thought it would be an interesting challenge to take some of the material from our fundamentals book and sort of turn it inside out and rethink it in what is in some ways sort of a graphic novel version of a software architecture book.
Well, and also, I always enjoy digressing in podcasts.
That's what podcasts are for. That is the lingua franca of podcasts, is digression.
and this is where you can get all sorts of information and personal stories you can't get from anywhere else. For example, when O'Reilly did approach us about doing the Head First book, Neal and I had finished up the software architecture, the hard parts, and we started working on the material for what we're still calling book.next, kind of our next book in our series. And sure enough, Neal said, Mark, this will be a slam dunk. We've already written the fundamentals of software architecture, so we've already kind of written this Head First book. All we have to do is really just reformat it in a different kind of style, and we'll all be done. So this would be great filler work. Mm-hmm. Well, fast forward 2 years, and we finally published it. Filler work, Neal. Yeah.
Mark actually left out an important phase there because we initially looked at doing it and then realized, wow, this is a very complex. It's not the artwork, the exercises, none of that is arbitrary. It's very, very planned, and there's a very, in many ways, rigid sort of format that you have to write within in Head First. And I had initially looked at that and said, I do not want to learn this wholly new style of writing and translate this at the same time. And so I was under no illusions. But then the critical part that Mark just left out is we discovered Raju. Actually, we ran across Raju again. We've known Raju for more than a decade now. We've known him for a long, long time and good friends with him. And he had just published Head First Get, which is a phenomenal book. It's the best Get book out there for sure. It actually shows off exactly how the Head First series is really good for hyper detailed things like Get. And so he knew the Head First language, and he's a knowledgeable software architect. And so he's the perfect collaborator to come on board and ease this transition, which I thought was going to be pretty easy. And of course, again, ended up taking 2 years, because it really is turning the subject inside out. It's show, don't tell. So many technical books are explaining things to you. Everything in Head First is turned inside out, where the examples drive all the exposition. And so it really was more challenging than we thought, but it yielded in many ways a completely different result, because it's head first. It's instead of back first, I guess, would be the traditional way of writing.
There you go. Yeah. But kind of, Neal, coming back to kind of your opening kind of question topic about why we wrote it. I liked your answer about the fact that different people learn in different kinds of styles. But also, I want to add to that the Head First book was written almost close to, well, at the time we were in the middle of writing it with Raju, it was 4 years after we had written the Fundamentals book. And it really did give all of us the opportunity, all of us authors, the opportunity to really revisit some of these topics and maybe shed some new light on these topics in a different kind of way. Some good examples, the event-driven architecture chapter in our Head First software architecture book is significantly different than that of the Fundamentals book. And it was really just not even copying what we had already written in the Fundamentals book, but really just taking a different approach of how to explain what events are and different kinds of events, and the granularity of an event processor or a service within there. And these kind of elements that we didn't touch on in the Fundamentals book, including what really are the differences between event-driven architecture and microservices, and how do they differ? And we had the opportunity to address all of these things we started to get questions about, and also learned ourselves since the writing of the Fundamentals book.
Well, and because Head First is more of an intro guide, meant to be more of an intro guide, we realized that we needed to address some things at a more fundamental level than we could in the Fundamentals book. And it frankly exposed some useful laziness that we had in the Fundamentals book, where we just sort of waved our hands around some topics that were too deep to get into, and just sort of, don't worry too much about that. If you're familiar, this is sort of like in physics. We don't really know how force at a distance works, but it works, and the math is there. So, however it works, it's okay. It's sort of like that.
Yeah. Well, and also the other thing that really does separate this book, the Head First software architecture book, from our other books, and one of the things, and several things that make it very unique, is it really is a learner's guide. In other words, Neal and I and Raju are basically taking your hand and walking with you, talking with you through the journey of software architecture. Case in point, about every 2 to 3 pages, there's an exercise in some different way, shape, or form to be able to test your knowledge of whether you really understand that kind of concept that we're talking about. And this is fairly unique in the book. In other words, it's a very hands-on approach to learning. One of the things I actually grew to appreciate and really like about the Head First book, when we were working on all of our first chapters, not necessarily in the order in which they are in the book, I started writing and drawing characters and having the characters have conversations and say witty things and all these call outs. And I submitted it for review, and it came back, well, that's pretty good, but you need an exercise here. You need an exercise here. And I had thrown a couple of exercises in the chapter, but by the time we went back and forth with the editors, I think my first chapter, Neal, I think I had almost 14 exercises. And these are kind of like those word match or fill in the blanks, or we tried
refrigerator magnets, or moving, shuffling things around, or
I forgot about the refrigerator magnets. Oh no, all of our magnets fell off the refrigerator. Can you put them back in order? And yeah, lots of kind of fun exercises. But that is one of the many things that makes this book unique and kind of a lot different than our other books.
Well, and there's a question here about what makes this book unique. This is unique amongst Head First books in that almost all Head First books prior to this one focused on a very specific technology problem. The kind of canonical Head First book, the first one that came out that really set the stage for the series, was Head First Design Patterns. And that's a great example of discrete problem in a context and very visual guide to solving that problem. So for example, one of the sort of premises in Head First is that no subject can span more than one chapter. Each chapter is self-contained. But software architecture is by its nature expansive and abstract. And so there are very few Head First books that are written about as abstract a subject as software architecture. Almost all of them are as concrete as granite, like Git. Could not be a more concrete, discrete subject, whereas software architecture is very fuzzy. So we had to get permission in this book to create a couple of specialty chapters that we call sidecar chapters. Because we go through the process of, the thinking of a software architect. We go through architecture characteristics analysis. We go through logical component analysis in separate chapters. But then we do a survey of all these different architecture styles. But at some point, you have to tie all those things together because you have building blocks, but you have no structure. And so that's what the sidecar chapters do. We take two chapters and pause in the sort of narrative flow of the book and do two chapters that are purely just example driven. And we take the characteristics and have the reader go through the architecture characteristics analysis for new problem and logical components and choose an architecture style and talk about the trade-offs. And that, as far as I know, is completely unique amongst the Head First books. But it's a great example of taking this learning style and being able to mold it and adapt it to subject areas that are more abstract than it's normally suited for, but bending it in such a way that I think it worked out quite nicely.
Well, and one of the things that I also grew to really appreciate while writing the Head First book was the use of all the various characters that we had available to us, because these characters were able to basically be the reader and kind of, fight us in some ways. Yeah, I think this is a bunch of nonsense, or this is just a guessing game, or you didn't explain data very well in that last section. What about data? And we were able to have them either be quizzitive or snarky or
here's a great example of that. The characters not only have names and visuals, but personalities. So, Mark, describe the difference between Skeptical Girl and Nina.
Oh, after a little over 2 years of writing that book, I still got them in the wrong place. Nina is a character in all of the Head First books, but especially ours, who is kind of the head of the class. they're basically smart and they're informative and astute and see things and saying, well, what about this? Or do these two connect?
They're
Am I seeing this?
anticipating your next transition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas skeptical girl is the snarky one, the one who basically is kind of saying this is a bunch of nonsense, or yeah, but what about this or this? I've heard that it's the other way around. Can you explain? And the use of these characters really helped to drive home some, well, alternatives and trade-offs, because that's what architecture is really, really full of, alternatives and trade-offs. And so we were able to actually leverage these characters and different cubicle conversations between, oh boy, do we remember them? Sam,
Nick and Sarah. No, Sarah was our editor.
right. No, the cubicle conversation.
Oh, Maya was one of them. I remember.
Maya, yeah. Anyways, they had specific names. Doesn't really matter, but we allowed them to kind of have a conversation between themselves to really draw out some of the ideas and understandings about what we were talking about.
Yeah, cubicle conversations in traditional head first books are there for exposition purposes, but we use them a lot for doing the essence of software architecture, which is discussing trade-off analysis. There were several chapters where we reached an impasse. Well, in one of the sidecar chapters, in fact, of, okay, we have two approaches. They both have pros and cons. Which one do we choose? And we used a cubicle conversation to simulate a sort of a real world interaction between stakeholders on a project to make those kind of decisions, which of course is, beyond just the nuts and bolts of software architecture. The real essence is being able to do that kind of trade-off analysis.
Yep. Yeah. So those were some of the interesting elements of the book, and also things that differ significantly from not only the material, but the style of learning from our other ones.
But one of the things Mark touched on is that it had been several years since the fundamentals book, and there were two things that we did in this book. One, which is add completely new material. We had just brushed against the idea of modular monolith in our fundamentals book, but in the intervening years, has become more and more popular and is certainly a legitimate monolithic architecture style, and even more so because it's such a great foundation for transitioning to a distributed architecture like microservices. It's the obvious transition migration path. And so we added a complete chapter on modular monolith and addressed it in a way that we had only barely addressed in the fundamentals book. But the other one is something that I was alluding to earlier, that topics that we felt compelled to go into a deeper dive on. And one of those topics that we'd sort of brushed aside in the fundamentals book was the difference between architecture and design, which is, don't worry yourself about that. But we felt really compelled because the head first book is really trying to lead the reader. And so it forced us, and of course, in the intervening years, one of the most common questions we get at panels and in workshops is, what is the difference between architecture and design? And of course, like so many things in software architecture, there is no binary, clean answer. It's a spectrum of how much is this an architecture decision versus a design decision. And because we'd gotten that question so much, that allowed us to actually address that question in a more fulsome way in the head first book, and talked about it being a spectrum, and gave some examples of, okay, is this more of an architecture level decision or more of a design decision? And I think that's useful when you're coming into this space, because there are some really fundamental questions like that are difficult to answer. And the main reason they're difficult to answer is exactly that. There are no clean binary distinctions between these things. So many things in software architecture is a messy spectrum, and figuring out what the ends of those spectra are, and then figuring out where you fall within that spectrum can very often help you to make better informed decisions about things.
Well, and as a matter of fact, Neal, I'm glad you drew out this particular example because it kind of shows how the Head First software architecture book actually works. Because what we were able to do quite a bit, as a matter of fact, in this book, is make liberal use of metaphors. And now Neal has a great quote about metaphors.
This is the models one. All models are, all models are wrong, but some are useful.
There you go.
And the
Yes.
same applies for metaphors.
and of course, we could not help ourselves by starting out the head first book with the building metaphor. And it is one of the most traditional ways of describing software architecture. And sure enough, we started out that way by showing a structure of a house, a typical flat, and the walls and the roof and just different elements that made up that shape, that external structure. And then diving in, we would open up that house and say, but what about the floor lamp or the carpet? Do you have wood floors or carpet floors? What color are the walls? Do you have wall hangings? And that was kind of the design piece. And this is not a new metaphor. As a matter of fact, this is what Neal commonly refers to as a tortured metaphor. And Neal's right. All models are wrong, but some are useful. But my point is, we were able to start with that and then take those concepts and actually describe a framework that Neal and I and Raju put together to really help define the spectrum between architecture and design. And there were a lot of aspects like, I don't know, Neal, we had some examples in the book that I'm trying to remember now. And I mean, I wrote that chapter, so I should probably remember them.
We're talking about things like ranches versus apartment buildings.
No, I was more thinking about those things that are in the spectrum in that metaphor, such as the electrical circuits going through the house, the plumbing, these sort of things. Is that architecture or is that design? And
most walls are design except the weight-bearing walls, which are architecture.
There you go. That's another good example. So we were able to transition to the spectrum. But one of the things that we did come up with as kind of, I'll call it although I hate the word, framework, like technique better, for really determining whether something is architecture or design. And we came up with 3 criteria. First of all, is it strategic of the decision we're making or the task we're doing? Is it strategic or is it tactical? Things that are strategic in nature tend to be more on the spectrum of architecture, and things that are more tactical tend to be design. That's the first one. And as a matter of fact, let me digress and say, well, how do I know if something's strategic? Some good indicators. How many people were involved in this decision? How long did it take? How many meetings did you have week after week with various stakeholders? Well, the more people involved and the longer it takes to make that decision probably means it's more strategic in nature and hence more towards architecture. And then there was the second one, Neal, that you want to talk about the second one, which is the effort piece.
Yep. So how much effort does it take to implement and or change this thing? Is this a high effort thing or is this a low effort thing? So classic example, if I'm changing from monolith to microservices, everything in my ecosystem has to change, including data schema, et cetera, versus I'm making something like a user interface change or a workflow change that's trivial and minor. So that's part of that spectrum of architecture versus design as well. And then there's a last one.
Yep. The last one is everything. This is from our fundamentals book in software architecture is a trade-off. Everything we do has a trade-off. However, how significant are those trade-offs? Trade-offs that tend to be more significant tend to be more on the architectural side of the spectrum versus those things that are fairly insignificant trade-offs. And so these are 3 criteria which we explain in the book and give lots of examples and exercises to be able to determine whether some things are architecture or design.
Well, and there's a great question here from Chris. Interesting chat about architecture versus design. I was a bit perplexed by this, as to me, architecture is a design process. And in fact, it is. You're doing structural design in architecture. The problem is user experience is also a design process. Putting components together is also a design process. In fact, we have a thing called design patterns that govern that. So design is much too broad a word. We have to be more specific when we talk about things like that. And so for us, this distinction of architecture versus design are exactly those three criteria: strategic versus tactical, effort, etc.
Right. Well, and the reason why we opened the book with this topic was because, first of all, it really helps us and the reader to understand what architecture really is. And the second part was also to really give a context to this real difference. Let me give you an example. I think we cited this one in the book. I want to move, or we're told, move the cancel button to the bottom of the screen. Okay, architecture or design? Well, clearly that's design, but here's the thing. Does moving the cancel button to the bottom have trade-offs? Well, sure, but they're pretty insignificant. It takes somebody 5 minutes to implement that, and probably took somebody only about an hour to make that decision to do this. But is moving the cancel button on the bottom of one of our screens going to derail this system or product? Is it going to significantly impact this system or product? And the answer is no, it's not, because it's not impacting the structure of that system. Whereas taking a modular monolith and saying, we're going to break that apart and move it to microservices. Now we can see that's clearly on the architecture side of the spectrum. And we can certainly go through all those criteria. It is strategic, very large effort, and the trade-offs are significant. We can completely impact the user experience, the responsiveness, the scalability, the time to market, our agility, our team topologies, how we deal with data. I mean, everything in our company or that division can be disrupted by that one single decision. And so this kind of points to one of the reasons this distinction is so important to analyze and understand.
Absolutely. So there was a question extant here, Mark, about favorite chapters. Did you have a favorite chapter in the first book?
Joking aside, yes, I would say that's tough to answer, but one that I enjoyed writing the most, and that was the event-driven architecture chapter.
I was going to guess either that or microservices.
Oh, no.
Both of those.
I am saving that microservices chapter for another discussion I'm hoping we're going to have in this podcast. No, the reason why it became my favorite chapter was when I started to write that, I kind of reflected on how am I going to describe to somebody exactly what event-driven architecture is. And it was challenging, but I really enjoyed the examples and hand-holding through it. And the characters just came to life in that one when we start talking about events and personifying those events through humans and characters. It just really started to resonate, even with me, on an effective way of describing event-driven architecture to somebody. So I think, Neal, I would have to say that was probably my favorite chapter because of those reasons. But how about you? What was yours?
I think my favorite part of a chapter, and toward this idea of personification, and we used to informally call these things doodads. One of the doodads that with the building blocks of head first was this thing called an interview, where you personify two technical things and have an interview with it, or personify a technical thing and have an interview with it. And so I wrote an interview with a plugin in a microkernel architecture. And the interview is asking it things like, what is your purpose in this architecture? Why did they name a whole architecture after you and all that? And, Headfirst really appreciates puns and other stuff like that. And so one of my favorite bits of terrible punniness in that writing was as we wrapped up that interview, the interviewer asked the plug-in, "Oh, is there any other things you'd like to plug before we go?" And so that was a nice, I thought, little punny in the Headfirst whimsical sort of style. But I think my favorite chapters overall were the two sidecar chapters, the unique chapters that work through the complete solution, because it allowed us to summarize things in a way that we hadn't had a chance to before and kind of piece things together. And I thought it was more entertaining because the regular chapters, frankly, and we've talked about this quite a bit, were kind of a pain to write because it's such a stringent structure. I mean, you basically can't introduce any topic without 3 pages because you have to have a transition from the previous topic with one of the doodads or something, and then you have to explain your new topic, and then of course there's an exercise, and so almost nothing is less than 3. And so, it's a lot of effort to write these chapters, organizing all the chapters. Those of you who have written something long form before, just imagine the horror of this. Every chapter every page, in a Headfirst book has a unique title on the page. Mark and I at some point sat down in a spreadsheet and created 450 unique titles for pages to organize what we thought the book was going to end up looking like. And so that's the level of detail that is required.
Yeah. Well, Neal, I had to go behind me and grab the book here because you reminded me, in event-driven architecture, which, like I said, was one of my favorite chapters, just because we had some fun with writing this. And I want to show you an example of this kind of fun. One of the elements that we had available to us in the Headfirst books is something called a fireside chat. It's very similar to the interview format that Neal was just describing, but basically it's 2 concepts, 2 topics that are basically talking back and forth, and it's supposed to be kind of witty and funny. Fun, but not funny. But I have to read you part of the fireside chat in event-driven architecture, because tonight's talk on fireside chats is asynchronous or synchronous communication. Who's more useful? Now, basically, think of a fireside chat as 2 people sitting in chairs surrounded by a fire, just kind of chatting. So we have asynchronous or async communication in one chair and sync communication in the other. And here's how the conversation goes. Async starts and says, "Well, it's about time you showed up." And sync says, "Sorry, I'm late. I can't seem to multitask, so everything I do takes such a long time." And then async says, "Yeah, I noticed. You're as slow as a herd of nails traveling through peanut butter." And then sync says, "Now wait just 1 minute." And async then says, "Wait? You want me to wait? That's your whole problem. You're always waiting around for answers. No one has to wait for me when I'm around, and that makes me fast, really fast." And the conversation continues like that, where they're bantering back and forth about the qualities of sync versus async in this kind of funny conversation. And it was, quite frankly, really fun to write.
and it's a great way to personify the differences rather than a boring chart or table showing differences between things, is that personification. And
Neal, I remember Raju Gandhi, he was kind of we called him our Headfirst whisperer. He's a great architect, but also knew the elements. And he kept telling us, guys, he said, it's supposed to be fun, but not funny. And there's a balance between being goofy in a book, but making it fun, but informative. And if you think that's easy, that's actually one of the challenges that we faced in this book.
So there's a great question here by, I guess, KSI, around finding boundaries between components and very hard, particularly when data is involved. You are correct. That is a really tough problem. And that's a great example of something that is really more in the design space than it is the architecture space. That's the purpose of things like domain-driven design or the actor-action model of this decomposition. And in fact, we have a chapter in our book on logical component design that talks exactly about how do you take a blank canvas in a problem space and start building components and carving out space and taking into account data dependencies along with those. So that is a lot of the essence of the logical component design and architecture. And we have an entire chapter about that. That's one of the two critical structural design parts in software architecture, the other part being architecture characteristics analysis.
Well, and as a matter of fact, KSI, on page 136 of our Head First book, we describe exactly what you're talking about. And we call it the entity trap, and we describe it in here as well. And this is where we start ending up designing components around database entities. And this is an anti-pattern, of course. It's something that is so tempting to do. But three problems occur. For example, let's say we have an entity called order, and it's a major database entity. We have the concept of an order in our order entry system. Well, if I make a component out of that, I'm going to call it the order manager component. Well, we see our first problem, because if I look at that component in my logical architecture or even physical architecture, and I look at the name, what does it do? And you look at the name order manager and it's like, well, I guess I'd have to infer that it manages orders. Yeah, that's probably true, but that's what the entire system is doing that we're building. So we see our first problem. When we start to model these components and form boundaries around the database entities, we suddenly lose the role and responsibility and description. We have no idea what this component does. We know it acts on that entity, but we have no idea the operations. Number two, have any of you ever written a class file named utility.java or util.cs or utility.py? Yeah, come on. Everyone raised their hand.
Well, every Java developer here has a string utils package somewhere.
There you go. And what is that utility class? Well, it becomes a dumping ground for everything you have no idea where else to put. And that's the other problem with going with a design based on database entities. Suddenly, these components get too large and they just become a dumping ground for stuff related to orders. And that leads kind of to the third piece, which is these components do get way too large from a granularity standpoint, and we start to lose our modularity within the system. So yes, this is a very common problem, so common that we coined it and then have it in both our books. The fundamentals, I believe we have it in there, Neal. Yep, and also the Head First software architecture. But there are two other ways we show in our Head First book of how to avoid this trap. And that is through something called a workflow approach and an actor-action approach. And so there are certain ways around this, what we call trap.
Okay, I think.
Well, you know what, Neal? We just kind of started with.
Evgeny?
Yeah. We just actually touched on some of the unique challenges. That was actually one that kind of came out in KSI's question, which was some of the unique challenges that we faced with writing this book. And I mentioned one, which was we need to make it witty and fun, but not goofy and funny. And that was actually one unique challenge. But I know Neal hit a big challenge starting in his very first chapter. And it was about kind of just this hand-holding style of writing versus the descriptive style of writing that all of our other books are in.
Yeah, it's hard to reorganize your writing style for that kind of inside-out writing.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a very show don't tell kind of form of writing.
Yeah. But I think the other unique challenge that was something we all three faced, I would say all three of us authors faced, were some of the constraints that are naturally put into a headfirst book. The fact that each topic could only span one, at most 2 pages. And if you think about trying to describe the difference between a message and an event, do that in 1 page. And oh boy, that was difficult. My biggest challenge, and I think we're going to close kind of soon with this, was the microservices chapter. And how do you describe microservices in a headfirst book? As a matter of fact, we can write a whole book about microservices. So I just had 1 chapter, and I kind of started out, I got about 35 pages written. Now, when I say written, these are all hand drawn in Adobe InDesign. And Raju told us it's about a day a page. And you know what? It was a day a page. So after a month, I wrote all this, showed it to our editor, showed it to Raju, and he's like, no. He said, this is the wrong approach. Instead of going top down, he said, you need to go bottom up. And I'm like, what? He said, yeah, flip this on its side. Well, I had to take 36 beautifully designed pages and basically hit the delete button and start all over. That was one of the unique challenges, was unlike a textbook where we just start writing a stream of consciousness. You cannot do that in a headfirst book. The flow, all the transition of the characters has to be extremely well thought out. You can't just kind of wing it in a chapter. And I think that was another unique challenge.
Well, that book became the graveyard of deleted pages. We both built a lot of pages that ended up deleting and redoing over and over.
Neal, the number of darlings we killed in that book. It's like
Well, guys, I really wish you could write at least 1 book a year, because you have such an ability to explain such complex things in such an easy and understandable way. So it's really a pleasure having your books, reading your books, and obviously having you here with us. Even it's for a promotion of a book, but it's a great knowledge that you're about to share with the community. So it was a pleasure, Neal, Mark, and we hope to see you soon. Hopefully with a new book.
Yeah.
And thank you very much for everybody who participated in the session.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.